Female kayaker swallowed by gigantic saltwater crocodile. The river was peaceful that morning, the kind of serene calm that lured adventurers seeking solace away from the noise of civilization. Emma paddled gently, the early sunlight casting golden reflections on the water's surface. The rhythmic splash of her paddle cut through the silence, each stroke propelling her kayak farther into the labyrinth of mangroves. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the fresh, earthy scent of the river. This was her escape, a place where the world slowed down and nothing seemed to matter beyond the next bend. Her bright orange life vest felt snug against her chest, a necessary precaution, though she rarely worried about any real danger. The only threats here were the occasional mosquito or the slippery mud that sometimes made getting back to shore tricky. She had kayaked these waters many times before, each journey a new chapter in her personal adventures. But today felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, a subtle tension that made her glance back over her shoulder more often than usual. The river narrowed as she ventured deeper, the towering mangroves casting long shadows across the water. Their twisted roots created natural barriers, forming hidden alcoves that seemed almost too quiet. Emma slowed her paddling, letting the current carry her for a moment. The silence pressed down on her, thick and heavy. No birds chirped from the branches above. No fish splashed beneath the surface. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was just her imagination. Maybe she was letting the eerie beauty of the place get to her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced down at the water. It was murky and dark, reflecting the tangled canopy above like a distorted mirror. Somewhere beneath that opaque surface, life teemed: fish, crabs, maybe even the occasional freshwater turtle, or something else entirely. Emma shook her head, laughing softly to herself. "Get a grip," she muttered, her voice sounding strange in the stillness. She dug her paddle back into the water and pushed forward, determined to enjoy the day. The river widened again, revealing a sunlit stretch that felt far more welcoming. She relaxed, the tension melting away as quickly as it had come. Her kayak glided smoothly, the paddle strokes becoming almost meditative. She began to hum a tune, her voice blending with the soft ripple of the water. The world felt right again, and she lost herself in the steady rhythm of her journey. Time seemed to blur as she paddled deeper into the wilderness, her thoughts wandering like the current. She thought about the long week she had left behind, work deadlines, endless emails, and the dull hum of daily life. Out here, none of it mattered. Out here, she was free. But the river wasn't done with her yet. A faint splash echoed from somewhere behind her, soft but distinct. Emma stopped mid-paddle, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the water. It could have been anything: a fish, a bird diving in for its breakfast. She waited, her breath caught in her chest, but the water remained still. After a moment, she shrugged and resumed paddling. Her pulse was steady again, her breathing calm. Then it happened again. Louder this time, closer. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her eyes darting across the river's surface. Nothing, just the same tranquil water stretching out behind her. She squinted, leaning slightly to get a better look. For a split second, she thought she saw something. A shadow just beneath the surface, moving fast and deliberate. But it vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but a gentle ripple in its wake. She chuckled nervously. "Okay, now you're really losing it." She turned back around, shaking her head at her own paranoia. It was probably just a log drifting along with the current. Still, she couldn't ignore the uneasy knot forming in her stomach. She tightened her grip on the paddle and quickened her pace, her strokes more forceful now. The sooner she reached the clearing up ahead, the better she'd feel. Open water always felt safer, more predictable. The river twisted ahead, curving sharply to the right. Emma leaned into the turn, her kayak gliding smoothly around the bend. The light shifted as she entered the next stretch, a narrow corridor framed by ancient mangroves, their roots clawing into the muddy banks like skeletal fingers. The air felt cooler here, the sun barely piercing through the dense canopy above. Emma's breath hitched as her eyes caught something up ahead. A disturbance in the water, a ripple far too large to be caused by a fish. It cut across the surface in a smooth arc, then disappeared. Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities, none of them comforting. Alligators didn't usually roam these waters, but saltwater crocodiles. Those were a different story. A sudden thud against the bottom of her kayak jolted her out of her thoughts. Emma yelped, nearly dropping her paddle. The kayak rocked dangerously, water sloshing against its sides. Her pulse skyrocketed as she looked down, her eyes wide with panic. For a terrifying second, she thought the kayak would capsize, dumping her into the dark water. But it held steady. She gripped the paddle with trembling hands, her eyes darting around wildly. "Calm down, Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. "It's probably just a rock. Nothing to worry about." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. She couldn't. Something was down there, something big. She could feel it in her bones, a primal instinct warning her that she was no longer the top predator in this part of the river. The water around her grew still again, the ripples fading into nothingness. Emma forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to slow her racing heart. She needed to think clearly to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help her now. She decided to head back. Whatever adventure she had hoped for today could wait. Right now, all she wanted was solid ground beneath her feet and the comfort of dry land. She turned the kayak around, paddling with steady, measured strokes. But the river wasn't ready to let her go. Another splash, this one directly behind her. It was loud and forceful, the kind of sound that made her blood run cold. Emma twisted around just in time to see it. A massive shadow cutting through the water, heading straight for her. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a crocodile. Not just any crocodile. A monster of a creature, its body longer than her kayak, with thick, armored scales and eyes that gleamed like twin amber lanterns. Its powerful tail sent waves rippling through the water as it closed the distance between them in seconds. Emma's instincts kicked in. She paddled furiously, her muscles burning with the effort. The kayak surged forward, but the crocodile was faster. Much faster. Emma's arms burned as she paddled with every ounce of strength she had. Each stroke sent a spray of water into the air, but the sound of the crocodile's relentless pursuit stayed right behind her. She dared not look back. She could hear it, its massive body slicing through the river, each powerful surge bringing it closer. The water churned violently around her kayak, creating waves that rocked her precariously. "Faster!" she gasped, her voice hoarse, her lungs begging for air. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop, to rest just for a second, but she knew that slowing down meant certain death. The open stretch of water she had been aiming for was still too far ahead. She wouldn't make it in time. The kayak suddenly jolted to the side, nearly flipping her into the river. Emma cried out, barely managing to steady herself. The crocodile had rammed the kayak from below, its sheer power terrifying. She glanced down, catching a glimpse of its monstrous form beneath the surface. Its jaws snapped open and shut with terrifying precision, just missing the bottom of her kayak. Her breath hitched as panic gripped her throat. There was no way she could out-paddle it. She had to think, and fast. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give her an advantage. To her left, a cluster of mangroves jutted out from the muddy bank. Their gnarled roots twisted into the water like a natural fortress. A plan began to form in her mind, risky, but it was her only shot. She steered the kayak toward the mangroves, praying that she could reach them before the crocodile caught up. The creature, sensing her change in direction, surged forward with even greater speed. Its head broke the surface, its jaws snapping just inches behind her kayak. Emma pushed harder, adrenaline flooding her system. The mangroves were closer now, just a few more strokes. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she made a desperate lunge for the tangled roots. With one final thrust of the paddle, she reached out and grabbed a thick root, pulling herself out of the kayak just as the crocodile struck. The kayak flipped violently, the force of the impact sending it spinning across the water. Emma clung to the root, her legs dangling in the river as the crocodile thrashed beneath her. Its massive tail whipped the water into a frenzy, sending waves crashing against the mangroves. She struggled to pull herself higher, her fingers slipping on the wet bark. The crocodile turned its attention back to her, its eyes locking onto its prey with terrifying focus. It lunged again, its jaws snapping just below her feet. Emma screamed, scrambling higher into the mangroves. Her foot caught on a root, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to fall. But she managed to find her balance, her heart pounding in her chest. For a few agonizing seconds, the crocodile hovered beneath her, its eyes never leaving hers. Then, slowly, it sank back beneath the surface, disappearing into the murky depths. Emma clung to the mangroves, her entire body trembling. She tried to catch her breath, but each gulp of air felt like fire in her lungs. Her mind raced. Was it gone? Or was it waiting? The water was calm again, eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. The crocodile hadn't given up. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Emma scanned the river, her pulse still racing. She had to move. But where? The mangroves offered temporary safety, but she couldn't stay there forever. She needed a plan, a way to reach solid ground without becoming the crocodile's next meal. Her eyes flicked to the far bank, where the dense forest promised shelter. It wasn't far, maybe 50 feet across the river. But 50 feet might as well have been 50 miles with the crocodile still out there. A ripple broke the surface, just a few feet away. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The crocodile's head rose from the water, its eyes fixed on her with cold, calculating intent. It wasn't going to let her go that easily. Emma tightened her grip on the mangrove roots, her mind racing. She couldn't wait any longer. If she stayed, the crocodile would find a way to get to her. She had to move now, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. She swung her legs up and hooked them around a sturdy branch. Her hands slipped, but she managed to hold on, inching her way higher into the mangrove's tangled embrace. The crocodile watched her every move, its eyes never blinking. It circled beneath her, its body a shadow in the murky water. Emma could feel its frustration, its hunger. It was just waiting for her to make a mistake. "Come on, think," she whispered to herself. "There has to be a way." Her eyes fell on a thick branch that stretched out over the river, just a few feet above the water. If she could shimmy across it, she might be able to drop into the river a safe distance away from the crocodile and swim for the far bank. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Carefully, Emma began to move along the branch, her body trembling with exhaustion. The rough bark bit into her hands, but she forced herself to keep going. Below her, the crocodile circled again, its tail cutting through the water like a scythe. When she reached the middle of the branch, she paused, her heart hammering in her chest. The water beneath her was deep, dark, and filled with the promise of danger. But she couldn't think about that. She had to focus. Emma took a deep breath. "Okay," she whispered. "You've got this." And then she let go. The world seemed to slow down as Emma fell, her body slicing through the air before crashing into the water below. The cold shock hit her like a brick wall, stealing the breath from her lungs. For a fleeting second, everything was silent. Just the muffled sound of water rushing around her and the pounding of her heart in her ears. Then she surfaced, gasping for air, her arms flailing as she fought to stay afloat. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to focus. She had to move, fast. The crocodile was still there, lurking somewhere in the murky depths. She couldn't give it time to strike. Emma kicked with all her strength, propelling herself toward the far bank. Her limbs felt like lead, every stroke a battle against the current and her own exhaustion. The muddy water clung to her skin, making her movements sluggish and awkward. She dared a glance over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the surface for any sign of the crocodile. It was gone. Her pulse spiked. Was it truly gone, or just waiting for her to let her guard down? The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through her veins, and she pushed harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. 30 feet. Her arms burned, her muscles screaming in protest. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to keep going. 20 feet. The far bank seemed impossibly far, like a distant mirage that mocked her every effort. Her legs cramped, threatening to lock up, but she refused to stop. 10 feet. The water grew shallower, the muddy bottom rising to meet her feet. Emma stumbled, her knees buckling as she tried to stand. She clawed her way onto the bank, collapsing onto the muddy shore with a guttural gasp. Her chest heaved, her body trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, she couldn't move, every fiber of her being focused on the simple act of breathing. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. Emma rolled onto her back, her eyes scanning the river. The surface was calm once again, the water shimmering in the fading light. The crocodile was nowhere to be seen. But that didn't mean it was gone. It was out there, waiting, hidden just below the surface. Watching. A shiver ran down her spine. She needed to get out of here now. She pushed herself up onto shaky legs, her bare feet sinking into the soft mud. Her eyes darted toward the forest, the dense foliage offering a sliver of hope. If she could reach it, she might have a chance. Her body protested with every step, but she forced herself to move. The forest loomed closer, each step a struggle against the weight of her exhaustion and fear. The muddy ground clung to her feet, slowing her down, but she refused to stop. When she finally reached the edge of the trees, she collapsed again, leaning against a thick trunk. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her vision swimming. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. "Okay. Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're safe. You made it." The words felt hollow, a fragile shield against the overwhelming fear that still gnawed at her insides. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the tree. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her drained and lightheaded. Her limbs felt heavy, her thoughts sluggish. A rustling sound snapped her back to reality. Her eyes flew open, her pulse spiking once again. The noise had come from deeper in the forest, a low, deliberate rustling that sent a chill down her spine. She scanned the shadows, her heart thudding in her chest. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. Silence. The forest watched her with an eerie stillness, every shadow seeming to shift and move just beyond her vision. The rustling came again, closer this time. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the tree, her eyes locked on the darkness. Her mind raced. Couldn't be the crocodile, it was too far from the water. But something was there. Something was watching her. Then, without warning, the bushes parted, and a small creature darted out. A raccoon, its eyes wide with curiosity. Emma let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her in waves. She sagged against the tree, her knees threatening to give out. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "You're jumping at shadows now." But deep down, she knew the danger wasn't over. The crocodile was still out there, and it wasn't the type to give up easily. It had tasted her fear, felt her vulnerability. It wouldn't forget. Emma's gaze drifted back toward the river. The water glimmered in the fading light, calm and deceptively beautiful. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something. A ripple, barely noticeable, cutting across the surface. It was gone in an instant, leaving her wondering if she had imagined it. Her skin prickled. She needed to get as far from the water as possible. The forest stretched endlessly before her, a maze of trees and shadows. It wasn't much, but it was her best chance. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Emma turned and started walking. Each step felt like a monumental effort, her body threatening to collapse with every movement. But she pressed on, driven by a simple, primal instinct: survival. The forest closed in around her, the canopy above blocking out what little light remained. The air grew cooler, the scent of earth and moss filling her nostrils. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet, the distant call of an unseen bird, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Her thoughts drifted to home, to the life she had left behind just a few hours ago. It felt like another world, a distant dream that had no place in the reality she now faced. All she wanted was to feel solid ground beneath her feet, to be wrapped in the warmth of safety and familiarity. But right now, safety was a luxury she couldn't afford. All she had was the forest, the fading light, and the relentless drive to keep moving. And somewhere behind her, the river waited, silent, patient. Emma trudged deeper into the forest, her legs heavy, her breath shallow. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind kept her moving, fueled by the primal need to survive. The canopy above thickened, shrouding the path in shadows. Every step seemed harder than the last, her feet sinking into the soft earth with each labored movement. The silence was deafening. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds. Only the rhythmic sound of her footsteps and the distant whisper of the river she had left behind. The eerie quiet wrapped around her like a blanket of dread, making her hyper-aware of every little movement in the dark. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign of pursuit. Nothing, just shadows dancing in the fading light. But she knew better than to trust appearances. The crocodile could be anywhere, and it wouldn't stop until it found her. Her hand instinctively went to the small knife strapped to her belt, a flimsy tool compared to the beast she had just escaped. It wouldn't stand a chance if the crocodile caught her again, but it was better than nothing. "You're fine," she muttered under her breath. "Just keep moving." The forest closed in tighter, the gnarled roots of ancient trees twisting up from the ground like skeletal fingers. Emma carefully navigated around them, her eyes flicking from one shadow to the next. The forest seemed alive, watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the stillness. Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Her eyes darted toward the sound. A fallen branch, just a few feet away, snapped in two. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the area, her breath caught in her chest. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. Then, from the shadows, a ripple of movement, a subtle shifting of leaves, too deliberate to be the wind. Something was out there, something big. Emma tightened her grip on the knife, her knuckles turning white. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. The seconds stretched into an eternity as she waited, every nerve on edge. Then she saw it, a massive, hulking shape emerging from the undergrowth. Her breath caught in her throat as the crocodile's monstrous form came into view, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the gloom. Its thick, armored body moved with a terrifying grace, each step deliberate and controlled. "No, no," Emma whispered, taking a step back. Her mind raced, but there was nowhere to run. The forest was too dense, the trees too close together. She was trapped. The crocodile advanced slowly, its gaze locked on her, its tail sweeping the ground behind it. It wasn't in the water anymore, but that didn't seem to matter. Its sheer size and strength made it just as deadly on land. Emma's breathing quickened, her chest tightening with panic. She clutched the knife tighter, her fingers trembling. She had to think fast, do something, anything, before it was too late. Her eyes darted to the trees above her, searching for a way out. If she could climb high enough, maybe she could stay out of its reach. She turned and scrambled for the nearest tree, her fingers clawing at the rough bark. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced herself upward, her feet slipping on the moss-covered trunk. The crocodile moved faster, closing the distance with alarming speed. Emma climbed higher, her heart pounding. The branches creaked under her weight, threatening to snap at any moment. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the crocodile just below her, its jaws snapping at the air. It let out a deep, guttural hiss, its eyes never leaving her. Emma clung to the branch, her body trembling. She was safe for the moment, but she knew it wouldn't last. The crocodile wouldn't leave without a fight. The branch groaned beneath her, and a sickening crack sent her heart into overdrive. "No, no, no," she whispered, gripping the tree for dear life. The branch tilted, sagging under her weight. She scrambled to find a more secure spot, but the bark was slick with moisture, her hands slipping with every movement. Then, without warning, the branch gave way. Emma's stomach lurched as she plummeted toward the ground, the world spinning around her. She hit the forest floor with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her side, but she didn't have time to process it. The crocodile was already closing in, its massive body blotting out what little light remained. Emma rolled onto her side, gasping for air, her vision blurred by pain and panic. She struggled to her feet, every muscle protesting, and stumbled toward the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at her face, roots tripped her feet, but she pushed on, her mind focused on one thing: escape. The crocodile crashed through the undergrowth behind her, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Its guttural growls echoed through the trees, sending a fresh wave of terror through her body. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning with the effort. She couldn't keep this up much longer. Her body was on the verge of collapse, her strength nearly gone. But she couldn't stop, not yet. A sudden break in the trees revealed a narrow ravine just ahead. Emma's heart leapt. If she could reach it, she might have a chance to lose the crocodile in the rocky terrain. She pushed herself harder, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the ravine. The crocodile roared behind her, its frustration palpable. Emma didn't dare look back. She reached the edge of the ravine and leapt, her body sailing through the air. For a fleeting moment, she felt weightless, free. Then she hit the ground, tumbling down the rocky slope. Sharp stones cut into her skin, and her body twisted painfully with each bounce. When she finally came to a stop at the bottom, her body was a tangled mess of pain and exhaustion. The world spun around her, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But the sound of the crocodile's guttural growl snapped her back to reality. It was still coming. Emma forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She stumbled toward the nearest cluster of rocks, her body running on pure instinct. She wedged herself into a narrow crevice, her chest heaving, her pulse thundering in her ears. The crocodile reached the edge of the ravine, its massive body silhouetted against the darkening sky. It peered down at her, its eyes gleaming with an almost malevolent intelligence. For a long, terrifying moment, it just stared at her, as if weighing its options. Then, slowly, it backed away, disappearing into the shadows. Emma collapsed against the rocks, her body racked with sobs. She had made it. She had survived. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Emma lay in the narrow crevice, her breath ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle ached. Every nerve felt frayed. For a moment, she thought she was safe, that the nightmare was finally over. But the silence around her was too heavy, too expectant. She couldn't let her guard down, not yet. The air was thick and suffocating, and the rocky walls pressed in on her like a tomb. She could still feel the crocodile's presence, even though it was nowhere in sight. Its memory lingered, its eyes cold and calculating, its jaws wide enough to swallow her whole. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. "Keep it together," she whispered. "You're almost out." Her voice sounded foreign in the oppressive stillness, a reminder that she was completely alone. Slowly, she crawled out of the crevice, her legs weak beneath her. The sky above had darkened to a deep indigo, the stars flickering faintly through the treetops. The forest was cloaked in shadows now, every rustling leaf a potential threat. Emma had to get out before it found her again. Her bare feet scraped against the jagged rocks as she moved toward higher ground. She pushed through branches and tangled vines, her body moving on instinct. Her eyes darted from side to side, every sound making her flinch. A sudden gust of wind sent a flurry of leaves dancing across the ground, and for a split second, she thought it was something far worse. Her pulse spiked again, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. Not when she was so close. The terrain began to slope upward, and the trees thinned out, revealing a glimpse of open sky. Relief bubbled up in her chest. She was almost there, almost free. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Then she heard it. A low, guttural hiss, soft but unmistakable. Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound sent a chill racing down her spine, every instinct screaming at her to run. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and moonlight. But then she saw it. The crocodile was back. Its massive form slithered silently from the shadows, its eyes gleaming like twin orbs of fire. It moved with terrifying precision, each step deliberate, its gaze locked on her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There was no time to think, no time to plan. She turned and ran, her legs burning with effort, her lungs on fire. The crocodile surged after her, its powerful body crashing through the underbrush like a freight train. The edge of the ravine loomed ahead once again. But this time, Emma didn't hesitate. She leapt without thinking, her body twisting in midair. The crocodile lunged after her, its jaws snapping shut just inches from her leg. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain exploded through her body, but she forced herself to get up, to keep moving. The crocodile slid to a stop at the edge, its eyes narrowing in frustration. For a long moment, they locked eyes, hunter and hunted. Then, with a low hiss, the beast retreated into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Emma collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She had survived. But as she lay there, staring up at the endless sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that the river wasn't done with her yet. Not entirely.